In early 2025, two of Congo's biggest cities fell, first Goma, then Bukavu. The national army, already stretched thin, was in retreat. Earlier, in order to fight back, President Félix Tshisekedi had made a bold gamble. He armed local militias known as the Wazalendo or patriots. On the front lines, the Wazalendo became his secret weapon, more active than the army, defending villages, blocking roads, and rallying communities. But by August 2025, the gamble was already showing cracks. In Uvira, Wazalendo fighters turned their guns on the very army they were meant to support. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the story of the Wazalendo of the Congo, Tshisekedi's secret weapon in the war with M23, and the risk of arming militias that the state cannot fully control. To understand how Congo reached this point, we have to go back to the end of 2021 when an old rebel movement returned to the battlefield. The March 23 movement, or M23, returned to war in late 2021 after nearly a decade of silence. At first, their presence seemed limited, with only a few skirmishes along the North Kivu border. But within a year, they were overrunning army positions, mounting larger offensives, and displacing thousands of civilians. The government in Kinshasa insisted that M23 was a proxy of Rwanda. That claim quickly drew international attention. Reports from United Nations experts and regional monitors added weight to the accusation, putting Kigali under growing pressure. By 2022 and 2023, M23 had transformed. No longer a small guerrilla band, they operated as a disciplined, well-supplied force. They defeated not only the Congolese army, the FARDC, but also regional reinforcements sent under the SADC banner and even Burundian troops. Now, the M23 rebellion had already laid bare the weakness of the Congolese army. On paper, the FARDC was one of the largest forces in the region. In practice, it was crippled by corruption, poor command, and weak training. Town after town fell, soldiers were overstretched, and Kinshasa turned to anyone who could help. Private contractors, Burundian allies, and even the Rwandan Hutu rebels of the FDLR. But President Tshisekedi wanted more. In November 2022, he called for the creation of vigilance groups against expansionist ambitions of the M23. His message was simple. If the army could not defend every village, then communities should defend themselves. That call gave birth to the Wazalendo, which means patriots in Swahili. President Tshisekedi then instructed the army to establish recruitment centers across the country in response to this call. Soon after, more than 30,000 young Congolese had joined the vigilante groups and started training with the Congolese army. These vigilante groups operated under the umbrella term Wazalendo. Groups like the APC-LS, the Nduma Defense of Congo, Nyatura factions, the Collective of Movements for Change, the Patriotic Self-Defense Movement, as well as the Mai Mai Mazembe began adopting the name Wazalendo. Many of these groups had existed for years, and some had even fought one another. Their motivations for joining the Wazalendo were varied. Some were driven by nationalism, others by the hope of money, army posts, or even amnesty for past crimes. Anyways, in May 2023, these scattered militias took a step toward unity. Leaders from across North Kivu met in the town of Pinga with Congolese army officers led by Colonel Salomon Tokolonga. Over 2 days, they negotiated a non-aggression pact and agreed to form a coalition against M23. The following month, Parliament passed a law creating an army reserve force to incorporate militias willing to fight alongside the Congolese army, the FARDC. Two generals with militia backgrounds, David Badiri Bulenda and Janvier Mayanga Wagishuba, were appointed to oversee the process. Finally, on September 3, 2023, the government officially legalized the Wazalendo's integration. From then on, selected groups received weapons, ammunition, and food directly from the state. Despite rivalries, disputes over supplies, and coordination problems, Wazalendo units fought consistently on the front lines. In many areas, they were far more active than the army itself. By 2023, the Wazalendo were no longer on the margins. They became a regular presence on the front lines, fighting alongside the FARDC in some of the fiercest clashes with M23. At Kichanga, for instance, their arrival gave the army a brief surge of momentum. Together, they pushed M23 out of key positions. For a moment, it looked as if the tide could turn, but then M23 regrouped and struck back, retaking the town. Tens of thousands of civilians fled in the process. By 2025, Wazalendo fighters were scattered across the front. Around Goma, Uvira, and Walikale, they blocked roads and defended villages. They even harassed M23 supply lines. Their presence widened the fight, covering ground the overstretched army could not. Communities rallied behind them, seeing the Wazalendo as protectors standing between their homes and the rebels. But the limits soon became clear. As I mentioned earlier, in early 2025, M23 and its alleged Rwandan allies launched a series of decisive offensives. Despite the Wazalendo's numbers and despite support from SADC contingents, Burundian troops, and even United Nations forces, M23 marched forward. Goma fell and then Bukavu. For President Tshisekedi, it was a gamble at breaking point. Wazalendo had made resistance possible, but not victory, and their determination came with new costs. Every Wazalendo counterattack forced families into repeated cycles of flight and return. Camps for the displaced swelled with each wave of violence. These Wazalendo fighters, far more active than the army in many contested areas, rejected any compromise with M23 and refused to soften the fight. Their continued military engagement, even while talks were underway, pushed the prospect of peace further from reach. Yet for Tshisekedi, abandoning the Wazalendo was never really an option. The army remained too weak, the threat too immediate. And so, despite the risks, Tshisekedi's government doubled down. So here's the thing. Outsourcing war to militias like the Wazalendo has long been part of Congo's conflicts, and it has endured for clear reasons. For the Congolese government, under pressure, it is cheaper. Supporting these Wazalendo costs far less than maintaining a full army with housing, salaries, and healthcare. The Wazalendo militias already live in the areas they defend, so they can be mobilized quickly without long supply chains. It also spares the leaders from confronting the army's deeper problems. As I mentioned in a video that I did a while back, the FARDC suffers from overlapping chains of command, entrenched corruption, and poor training. Reforming the army would take years and could provoke backlash from powerful officers. And so, as a result, for the Congolese government, turning to militias like the Wazalendo is a shortcut. It puts fighters in the field without forcing reforms on an institution that resists change. The Wazalendo bring other advantages. It is said that their morale is often higher than that of regular soldiers. Commanders use the Wazalendo to harass enemies, block supply routes, and extend influence into areas the army cannot reach. But outsourcing to the Wazalendo is not just about security. Each arrangement carries a budget, and with it comes opportunities for kickbacks and even embezzlement. The Wazalendo run roadblocks, tax local trade, and control mines, generating income not just for their own fighters but also for the FARDC officers who sponsor them. In this way, war in the Congo becomes a business. Now, at the same time, the rise of the Wazalendo has also revealed the darker side of this strategy. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other monitors have documented abuses under the Wazalendo name. As I mentioned earlier, civilians are taxed at roadblocks, and in some cases, entire communities have been punished along ethnic lines. The line between the militias and the national army is now blurred. FARDC commanders supply weapons, ammunition, and food, and many operations are coordinated. That cooperation means abuses committed by Wazalendo fighters can also implicate the army itself. For President Tshisekedi and his government, this is a dangerous dilemma. By outsourcing the war, his government risks sharing responsibility for crimes committed in its name. You will see later in the video how some of these elements that I have spoken about are slowly coming to the fore when it comes to the Wazalendo. Meanwhile, Rwanda has seized on the abuses that the Wazalendo have been accused of for political advantage. President Paul Kagame accuses the Wazalendo, the FARDC as well as the FDLR of committing atrocities in eastern Congo. In his narrative, the Wazalendo are not patriots but instruments of an ethnic war carried out with government support. On 26 August 2025, gunfire echoed through the streets of Uvira. By the end of that day, about 8 people were dead and the city was gripped with fear. The fighting wasn't with M23, but between the FARDC soldiers and their supposed allies, the Wazalendo militias. Now, for the residents, it was the last thing they needed. Rumors were already swirling that M23 was closing in. So, after this squabble between the FARDC and the Wazalendo, the provincial governor quickly called an extraordinary meeting with army officers, religious leaders, traditional chiefs, and Wazalendo commanders. He urged both sides to avoid falling into the enemy's trap. But the timing was troubling. Just days earlier, M23 fighters had seized Lubumba, only 80 kilometers away. By arming Wazalendo militias, Kinshasa hoped to create a grassroots defense against M23. Instead, it may have empowered groups it cannot fully control. Once hailed as patriots, it appears as if some of the Wazalendo are now turning their weapons on the very army they were meant to support. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.